We're going to jump into the specifics of the Nuggets roster building concerns for the summer. But I wanted to just throw out a couple of key dates for Nuggets fans that want to know, like, what are the important times of the offseason. So there are a couple of options coming up. KCP has his player option deadline on June 29th. Reggie Jackson has his player option deadline on June 25th. Vlatko Chanchar has a team option deadline on June 23rd. Draft night starts on June 27th. The NBA is doing a 2-night draft this year. And so the second round is going to take place on the 27th. Sorry, the 26th is the first round. And then comes the moratorium period, which is the 5 days between July 1st and 6th when teams can start negotiating with free agents from other teams. Right now, they're actually able to negotiate with their pending free agents that are currently on their rosters. And then starting on July 6th, free agency is officially open, and all of the deals that have definitely been being negotiated even outside of the legal times are going to come out and become official. And we're going to find out who's changing teams, who's staying on their teams, etc. That's also the day that Jamal Murray becomes extension eligible. And we're going to talk about those things in the context of the Nuggets roster soon. So for our first segment, what I wanted to do was kind of establish the battlegrounds for this Nuggets offseason and talk about how are we good? How are we bad? How do we need to improve? Right. So Will and I came up with this fact or fiction segment to assess what the particular strengths and weaknesses of the Nuggets were this season. So we'll just throw something out there about the Nuggets, and you can tell us if it's fact or fiction and elaborate as you see fit, Zamora. Will, do you want to do the first one?
All right. So the first point about the Nuggets that we want to bring up is, despite their flaws, the Nuggets roster this past season was good enough to win a title. Now, Zamora, you go first.
Okay. No, I'm just playing. I think so. Absolutely. I think they were. I think you can build your team up to be good enough to win a title. And then depending on injuries, depending on matchups, all that stuff, you just hope that you make it through the playoffs at that point. I think as far as like talent wise, we were at least a top 3 roster. Chemistry wise, we were number 1 probably in the NBA. So I think, those are probably my 2 biggest things. So I think absolutely we're right there. I think we just ran into a team that was built really well to defend what the Nuggets like to do, whether it was intentionally built like that or not. I think they just were like built well for that matchup.
I think that's a really good point that you make about all you can do is kind of build a roster that like has a chance, right? Because we're going to get into some questions of what the role of, the front office versus the coaches versus like what the players actually have to do on the court is in this. And a lot of what we're talking about is when we go through the offseason is the role of the front office in building up the roster to have a chance. But all of these things, interact. And so coming up with what the level of responsibility is for a general manager of a contending team anyway, it's going to be an interesting discussion. So our next factor, fiction, the defensive improvement by the Nuggets, where they went from 18th in defense in the 22 to 23 season to 9th in defense. That's top 10, obviously. This past season was real. Fact or fiction?
Fact. I think P-Watt was a huge contributor to that. We've never had a rim protector like him. He's a very good perimeter defender as well. But most importantly, I think it was just chemistry, building on the things that they built last year. I think KCP, having a full year under Malone and knowing coming into this season, like what his full responsibilities were, Knowing the weaknesses of his teammates and stuff like that, I think really helped, went a long way. Being more comfortable with communicating with these guys and, knowing how to, like, I imagine it's not easy going up to a 7-foot tall Serbian guy and telling him, like, I need you to stand over here instead of over there when, I'm pushing a guy this way or something, Like, I think just stuff like that, the little things that we don't really think about, I think that goes a long way, especially on defense, where, like, defense is a lot of chemistry. It's a lot of communication, it's a lot of little things. It's not, offensive is more about being talented and hitting your shots and, can you handle the ball and stuff like that. Defense is more of like, can we be good teammates? Can we work together well? Do I understand that if you're pushing him this way, where I'm supposed to be positioned at to help you in the best way? Am I supposed to tag off of a guy because I seen him get a step on you? All those little things like that, I think are what really make a good defense a good defense.
Last year when we won the title, everyone was questioning our defense, and then we got to the playoffs and our defense rose up. Their level of play was definitely better than the regular season. This season, we improved defensively just overall throughout the season, but in the Wolves series, we were like frustrated with how the hell are we going to guard the Wolves? Like, we don't have an answer for Ant, and we were unsure of what to do. And then P-Watt didn't even get to play. What was your impression of how our defense was from the regular season to this playoffs?
It didn't take the leap that it did from, last year's playoffs. But I also don't think it was like there was that much more room to leap because of how good they were in the regular season. Ant is just a problem, man. Ant is ridiculous. He's just way too strong. He's got the strength of a power forward, but he's also quick, super quick laterally. Ant just has an incredible first step. If there's a bigger defender than him, like an Aaron Gordon or anything, he's just going to blow by him. It's pretty much impossible to really stop Anthony Edwards. There's just not a lot of defenders in the NBA who are capable of, slowing that guy down. That's why he was drafted number 1, right? He has the strength of, a power forward. He has the speed of a quick guard. He has the vertical of LeBron James. He has all the talent in the world. I think he's just
like prime LeBron, not current LeBron.
He's putting it together. Just about him putting it together was the question mark for him, and he's starting to put it together.
I actually will say on that point that in the Wolves series, I thought our defense was okay, especially as the series went on. But it was one of those things you talked about the defensive matchup issues that the Wolves give the Nuggets. But I think that was a series where okay defense wasn't going to be enough if our offense wasn't going to be able to show up. And that's what happened in that series, I think, more than even the defense. And it was one of those things where, okay, our offense is sputtering, but there were certain series where we have matchup advantages on defense, so we could be so stifling that it doesn't matter. But in that series, we don't have quite the same advantages, so our decent enough defense wasn't going to be enough when our offense couldn't show up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, when it couldn't carry it.
Our next factor fiction was it's really about the energy levels of the team. Do you think that the Nuggets, the players, we're talking about the starters for the most part, that they were only sluggish because of championship hangover? And you can talk about all of the starters as a group, or you can talk about them individually.
I think to an extent they were tired, just because I think Jokic was tired. He's had past 4 years, he hasn't really had an off season,
Still not getting one.
Yeah, exactly. So I could see why, he looks so tired. And I mean, he played 47 out of 48 minutes. You can't really blame the guy too much for that. I think it's just one thing I can't stand though is we always talk about the Nuggets being tired. A lot of the times it comes down to Jamal Murray too. But there's always, this narrative, oh, the Nuggets are tired. But they play the same amount of games as everybody else. They, everybody is at the same attrition levels. They, granted there are injuries and, bumps and bruises here and there that, some teams pick up that others don't. But I just never really bought into the whole, the Nuggets as a whole were just too tired to pull that off. I think I think Jokic has a reason to be tired because he's carried this team for the past like 4 or 5 years, especially when Jamal was hurt for those 2 years. And he has to play for Team Serbia. He never really gets an off season or anything like that. But I mean, as far as the rest of the guys, I just don't really see why that would be a reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's this weird thing where like even MPJ, he had his first kind of full season where he played. What did he play? Like 80 games or something, or I don't know.
81.
Yeah, and we
Yeah.
all loved that. We were like celebrating that. And I don't think like obviously he's not carrying the offense. And I don't know if some of his, lack of production, for lack of a better term, was due to him being tired. Like it was more
No.
schematic and like matchup based where people were taking him away, and his off ball stuff was more difficult for him to integrate. But then like we kind of look back on it all with hindsight, and we're like, oh, I guess they were tired. That makes sense, and we're almost like rationalizing it a bit. But I was with you where I was like, I don't want to hear the excuses necessarily of being super tired because that's what every team is like. But I get, we did play until June. The Heat didn't have an amazing season either, but they had some injuries and things along those lines. But it's hard to reconcile all of it.
The Heat
Yeah.
really didn't have an amazing season either. I will say just on that point that I do think that the answer differs between different starters and different types of players. Like I am willing to give a little bit more like credence to that, let's say, explanation. I don't want to call it an excuse either, because the fact of the matter is, like, do you want to win a championship or not? But when it comes to the bigs, from what we know about the physical toll that bigger players' bodies take as their minutes accumulate compared to other types of players, you can give them a little bit more, let's say, grace when it comes to like, okay, we really do need to manage their minutes during the season. But when it comes to, and you can give those two players in particular that grace, because it's not like Jokic came into the season super conditioned anyway, but he has a really high floor. So it's like, yeah, we'd like a lot more from you, or like a little bit more from you, but like, how much are we really asking? Meanwhile, you have a player like Jamal who never comes into the season conditioned. We can cross our fingers and hope that happens next year. And I'm one of the people doing that, but it's a lot less of an excuse for him, because it's like, you're not the same kind of big player. You don't have anywhere near the same kind of physical burden that AG or Yoke have, or even KCP when you think about the defensive assignments. With MPJ, you could be like, well, his shooting is clearly impacted depending on the amount of rest that he has, but he contributes in a lot of other ways. Whereas like when Jamal is like off, it throws everything off. And we saw what that looked like in these playoffs when he was probably the most off that he's ever been in any regular season or playoffs combined, right? And so there's multiple kind of components to that fatigue point.
I will say though too that
Yeah.
Jamal, for game 7, I'll at least give him a little bit of a pass, just because that their game plan, they intended on tiring him out. Now, they knew he was susceptible to that, and you got to give the Wolves credit for, looking into that and being like, we've got to try to tire him out as much as we can. But they really sent Cat at him like repeatedly. They got the switch
You
on
mean
him,
Ant?
as Cat and Ant.
Oh, you mean on
Yeah, Cat was
defense?
posting him up. Yeah, Cat was like constantly
that's-
posting him up, banging
Yeah.
into him. So, I mean, that's tiring.
It is, but that's the thing, is like, we talked about this even, we as like a fandom talked about this even last year, how that's basically every team's plan against Jamal. And this season, he made it incredibly easy for that to be effective, right?
Yeah.
We even saw it in the Phoenix series last year, where it was effective for, I would say, a game and a half. I thought he was better in game 4 than game 3, but there were other problems with the way the team defense, whatever. But it's one of those things where it's like, okay, like, can you stop being this much of the weak point? Because yeah, it was an issue. So regardless of that game plan.
So this next question is about Calvin Booth's Project Dynasty, the 2-timeline plan. Does this 2-timeline plan end up like the Warriors?
I.e. a train wreck.
I.e. they I don't think they won their championship that they won because of that plan. I think it was more. I think
no.
by the time the Warriors didn't make the playoffs this season, and it looks like Clay is on the way out. They're and it. I mean, Kuminga is looking pretty good, but do the Nuggets seem like they'll be more successful than the Warriors? Where they're keeping their core and our young dudes are able to contribute.
I think that the expectations are very different. I think on a base level, you can say, oh, this is the same thing that the Warriors were doing because you're trying to bring in young guys to like supplement extra, I guess, bodies on, just to create depth on your team or whatever. But I think the Warriors kind of had a plan that these guys were going to be like their franchise guys, once Steph and Clay and Draymond were like getting older, like as they phased out, Wiseman, Kuminga, and Moody would be able to take over and carry the load. And the expectations
and Poole was part of that.
And Poole, Poole
right?
too. But the Nuggets don't have those expectations on these guys. The Nuggets' expectations for Christian Brown, for Peyton Watson, even Julian Strawther and these guys is come in and just be a good piece around Jokic. We have our star. He's not aging out anytime soon, hopefully. Just come in and be a contributor, play defense, hit your open threes. We're not asking you to be the face of the franchise or anything like that. So I think expectations wise, I think they're far more capable of reaching their expectations than Moody or Kuminga or any of those guys. So I think it's just a little bit different. And I think they'll be able to, I'm optimistic, I guess, but I think they're very well within the means to be able to reach those expectations.
Yeah, you draw a good distinction with the Warriors and the Nuggets because it's like, yeah, our guys are still here. They're not taking over for Jamal and Jokic. They're just trying to be like role players, which also brings up interesting questions about like drafting players and having these expectations of like you're just supposed to be a 3-and-D role player in some regards instead of like developing them to their like specific strength. Which is, I guess, kind of why we like got rid of Bones.
Ideally, you're drafting guys that would be their
that is like
strength,
their strength,
right?
But then like someone could maybe surprise you where you draft them to be like a 3-and-D, and then like who knows what they become. I'm trying to think of like an example of maybe someone who was like
Peyton.
slated to be a role player and then became maybe like
a star,
or something like that. But I don't
Kawhi.
know.
Yeah, Kawhi. Yeah. That's the first one I thought of.
Yeah.
All right, so we talked about some of the good things. We had the defense. We talked about how the roster would have been good enough to win a title potentially if the team had been, maybe managed better. I'm just going to list off the major issues that we saw in the playoffs with the way that the team was currently constructed. So Jamal's health was an issue. We needed more ball handling. We knew that all year. The shooting was mid to bad. We had a lack of reliable starting lineups or lineups outside of the starting five. And we had thus an over reliance on the starters in the playoffs in that particular configuration. So I'll just say, throw it out there, fact or fiction, every major issue that the Nuggets had in the playoffs were completely foreseeable based on what we saw in the regular season.
I think you could say that. There were indicators, right? There were things that, I guess, statistics that would pop up. I mean, I remember Matt Moore specifically was like shouting, for like the last month of the season, like, there are significant indicators here that the team isn't as good as it used to be and all this stuff. It was kind of, I don't know, came off as like grumpy old man or whatever. But
he kept ignoring some of the good stuff too, which made it kind of annoying. There were other indicators that we were better than last year, but
but he was focusing on the negative ones. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day though, I just think like the playoffs are such a different beast than the regular season that you can take like 90% of the data that you've gathered throughout the regular season and kind of throw it out. I mean, there are teams that like frankly will like lose to a team over and over and over again, and then in the playoffs just be way better than them.
Sweep them.
Yeah,
like the Wolves with the Suns.
Minnesota and Phoenix, right? I think there's just so much noise in the regular season. There's just so many factors that just do not come into play when it comes into the playoffs. There are indicators and stuff like that, but doesn't
the Celtics run this year and the Nuggets run last year show that like the regular season does matter in terms of showing you who the best teams are, what their strengths are, etc. Right?
I think like there are flashes, right? I think there are points in the season where a team shows you their true character and like who they really are, especially if they get to a point where like their backs are against the wall and stuff like that. I mean, look at the reason I was so high on the Nuggets this year was like their huge stretch run after the All-Star break and, you know, beating the Celtics twice this year. They're just like things like that that you kind of have to focus on a team pretty consistently throughout the regular season to like see these things. And, you know, that's why a lot of fans will be like, oh, my team is different, you know? I don't know. I
As
just
it
feel like
turns out,
there's,
we weren't different.
yeah, but we were a contender, you know? Like we were a really good team. I think if we would have beat the Wolves, we would have had just as good a chance to beat the Celtics as anybody else,
Hmm.
you know? I just think like you see those special moments throughout the season.
So, you've identified several weak areas with the team analytically based on the regular season, since we're on the topic. If we could fix all of it, we would, right?
Yeah.
But if could you pinpoint 2 or 3 specific areas that you would prioritize this off season and why those areas above the other, problem areas?
Ball handling, ball handling, ball handling. It was driving me nuts all year long. I mean, I was saying this well before the All-Star break that we need another ball handler because Jamal was getting injured. Colin and Jalen were just not ready. Reggie, well, he looked decent at the beginning of the season. Like he looked like he could do it, but it was like if Reggie is the only guy that you have, you know, backing up Jamal, like it's just not enough. I'm coming from like the Tim Conley era of like you have Will Barton, Monte Morris, Jamal, you know, all these guys.
It
We
was
kind of
just never an
sacrificed.
issue before.
Yeah, we kind of sacrificed all of our playmaking for size. Like you said one time, like there's just trade-offs, you know, it's about
Yeah.
trade-offs, you know. There are just things that you have to sacrifice. And unfortunately, we sacrificed so much ball handling to cover some of the other areas that we were lacking in ball handling now. And it really showed itself in the playoffs.
Yeah, your ball handling is your number one priority. Playmaking is really important on this team, on any team, especially for playoff versatility. That's an argument that I've heard a lot of people make, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Even with the multiple year sort of success of the Boston Celtics, like even if they don't make the finals or win a chip like they did this year, they're in the conference finals every single year, and they always have a lot of ball handling on the floor between Tatum, Brown, whether it was Marcus Smart or Derek White. And this year they also added Drew Holiday, right? And it's just like you constantly have guys on the floor who can make plays, and that's really helped their playoff versatility.
Well, thank you again for joining us. That's it for us. So if you've made it this far, like and subscribe and turn the notification bell on YouTube and leave a rating on any podcast platforms that you're listening to. We're still trying to get on Apple Podcasts. And just remember that winning is fun and losing sucks.